Hello and welcome to Riverland Women, the podcast which celebrates the amazing achievements and inspiring stories of women across South Australia's Riverland. I'm your host, Kerry Lush from the podcast station. Join me each fortnight as we meet some of the extraordinary women who call this region home. This is Riverland Women. In this episode of Riverland Women, we meet Dr. Corina Sims, a rural GP and obstetrician in Renmark. Corina's story is nothing short of amazing and, in some parts, almost unbelievable. Growing up in the United States, her childhood was tough, and that's putting it mildly. There was domestic violence, drug addiction, poverty, multiple relocations, and time spent with foster families and grandparents. But despite the odds, Corina continues to thrive in her new life in Australia. This is Corina's story.
I was born in California and I went to, elementary school there up until I was about 8, and then moved to Oregon, which is on the West Coast as well. And then there was a year in Missouri, and then back over to Washington State, and then back to California. So I spent a lot of my childhood in different places and a bit of a rocky childhood. So raising my children here, I suppose, is completely different than anything that I would have experienced there. And I think because of where I've come from, Australia just felt so safe to me.
So how did you end up growing up in the US to being a GP in the Riverland of South Australia?
Well, that's a long story. So I'll just go back. I was the first person in my family to graduate from high school. And when I graduated from high school, university wasn't on my radar because it wasn't something coming from a very poor, I suppose, background and from uneducated family. University just wasn't on my radar because only people who had a lot of money or were like at the top of their class got to go to university. So I probably could have been somewhere toward the top of my class, but because it wasn't something that was encouraged, I never really considered it. I really skated through high school. It was very, it was just easy, and I enjoyed the social aspect of it. So I graduated, and then one thing led to another. I worked out that I could actually go to university. So in America, they've got something called a junior college. So it's a 2-year school, 2-year program. You can get a degree, and from there, you can transfer to a 4-year university. So in America, the bachelor's degrees are 4 years. And so you could do your curriculum. So again, in America, the first 2 years are spent doing like English, math, history. There's different requirements. And so you could do those at the 2-year school, which was fairly cheap. And pretty much anybody could go to university, or, it's called community college or junior college. So I somehow worked out that I could do that. That still took me a while because then I had no idea what I wanted to do. Eventually, and amongst all of that, I also got married when I was 21 to my high school sweetheart who was in the military, and we traveled a bit. So eventually I ended up with a 2-year degree. And along that way, I had a job with the Red Cross. And I just kind of stumbled on that. I used to do, temporary work, kind of office work when we would move to different places. And I took a temporary position at this Red Cross. And they trained me to do health and safety first aid classes. And immediately, I thought, I love this. My husband at the time was a hospital corpsman, which is a Navy, like a medic that worked with the Marine Corps. I loved the Marine Corps. And I would go home and I would ask him all these questions like, well, what would happen if there was an accident and this happened or that happened? I was just absolutely fascinated. And so it was probably there that I decided I wanted to do medicine. And then once I worked that out, I could transfer to a 4-year school. And then during that portion of my life, my husband also was he finished in the military and he transferred. He had been doing his 2-year program as well. We both transferred to the university. We both wanted to go to medical school. And so the way that it worked out, he was a resident of a different state just because of just the way things worked out when you move around. And it was going to be very hard to get into the same medical school because they take preference of the residents of that state. And so as like hedging your bets, we started to look at other options. Flinders University was recruiting for their business program at our university. And I just happened to stumble across them when I was walking across campus one day. And I thought, oh, how cool would that be? You do medical school in Australia. So I stopped and I asked them if they had a medical school, and they did. And it was a post-grad program, which is, that's how you do it. In America, you do your 4 years and that's usually like a pre-med of some sort. And then you transfer or you get accepted into medical school. So they did, and we threw in applications and they took us both. And so we just, at that point, we'd been married for 9 years and we sold everything we owned and took a couple of boxes and came to Australia, never to stay. It was just to do medical school and then go back home.
Wow, so what a sliding doors moment like that, walking across the campus, seeing that thing there.
Yeah. And another sliding door. So I am a pseudo artist. I like to paint and draw. And I was finding that I wasn't getting enough time to do that kind of stuff. So I approached the art department of that university and said, hey, I'd really like to study art as well as my biology degree, which is going to be my pre-med. And they gave me a scholarship to study art. So I ended up graduating with a dual degree in art and biology. And not knowing if we'd get into medical school or not, I started applying for jobs in art. And I actually got I got offered a job with the Education and Arts Department for the state of Washington. And so it was at the point where we didn't know, if we had been accepted anywhere. And so I had to decide, what am I going to do? Am I going to go down that road? Or am I going to go down that road? And then we got the acceptance. And so I turned down the job and came to Australia.
Wow. Wow. And how many other people would have had a double degree in biology and art?
Yeah, it was pretty cool. Like once I got credits for doing a cadaver dissection. So that's part of the biology degree. Do you know?
No.
So that's how we learn anatomy in medicine is people donate their bodies and then we dissect them. And so I did the dissection and then I drew with colored pencils. I did these diagrams of the body parts. And so I got credits in both subjects. It's pretty cool.
Were you always arty as a kid?
It's interesting. So part of that colorful background, both of my parents were very talented, did nothing with it. My brother is extraordinarily talented, both with art and with music. So he could, listen to a song on the radio and then just play it on the guitar. I didn't get any of that. Damn it. So I always thought I had no talent because they were just so good. Comparison is the thief of joy. And it wasn't until that junior college experience when I had no idea what I wanted to do. And I took engineering course. I love problem solving, which is part of why I love medicine, because it is problem solving. But I love math. And so I took some engineering courses thinking, well, that makes sense. It's math, it's problem solving. Of course, that's what I'll end up doing. And then I hated it. I'm not one of those people that take things apart just to see how they work. And so I quickly realized that wasn't a thing. But I thought I'll take maybe a drawing. I think it was a drawing class I started with just for fun. And I realized quite quickly that art teacher the first day had us pick up a magazine and just draw something so he can kind of see where we were with our levels. And he came around and said, oh, wow. And I'm like, really? Wow. Oh, okay. Maybe I have some talent. And so unfortunately for me, my family was pretty naturally gifted that way. I had to actually really work at it.
So you go back to where you were. You've got this chance to come to Australia, come to Flinders. Where to from there?
Oh, gosh.
How was it moving from to the other side of the world?
It was awesome. It was just, like...
All right. Do you want me to start?
That's bizarre. Sorry.
No, yeah.
Wow.
Do you want to pause for a bit?
I am just so grateful to be able to have raised my children here. They were the hardest years of my life, but the most amazing.
At this point, I just want to break into the interview. I knew there was so much more to Corina's background story because she'd shared some of it on her podcast. After finishing the recording and reflecting, I knew we'd only just scratched the surface about her family and her upbringing. Corina had the same thoughts, so I asked if she could record in her own time and space a little bit more about her earlier years.
I was born to a teenage mum, less than a week from her 18th birthday. My mum was one of 9 children there were 7 different fathers for those 9 children. And she had an incredibly traumatic childhood. So my mum didn't have any full-blooded brothers or sisters. And her dad was actually a married man to another woman. Believe it or not, the bread man from the local corner store who one day offered to give my grandma a lift home and gave her more than just a lift home. My mom she grew up not having a relationship with her father. She did find him when she was a teenager, and I won't go into that, but it wasn't a great situation. So never really had a relationship with her father. She was married for the first time at 16 years old to her heroin dealer. He's the one who introduced her to heroin. And she struggled with heroin addiction until she died at the age of 38 from an IV drug use connected problem. My mom and my dad had a pretty volatile, very violent relationship. There were tales of them finding out they were pregnant with me when they were in Southern California robbing gas stations, was how the story goes. And I have seen photos of them with both of their hair dyed jet black, apparently to evade the authorities. There was a lot of violence in our home, and it went both ways. My mom once put a hatchet into my dad's head, and my dad once tried to run over my mother while she was still in the house, so the car ended up on the front porch. So yeah, there was a lot of domestic violence. That relationship obviously didn't last a whole long time, thankfully, and we spent a lot of our younger years kind of in and out, so my brother and I, in and out of either being with mom or dad or the grandparents. There were foster homes in between, and then the grandparents, so my dad's parents, would come and rescue us. When I was 7, my mom's brother murdered her boyfriend. Oh my gosh, this just sounds insane. Murdered her boyfriend because he had threatened, the story goes, to harm my brother and I if she didn't run away with him. Something to that effect. So I won't go into the details. It was pretty gory. My mom went to jail as an accomplice to that crime and was eventually released. In that interim, we were with my grandparents and my dad. And when she was released from jail, they thought that it was a good idea to try again. So they tried again, which then, of course, ended in violence. And eventually, I don't even think that lasted a year. My mom ran away with a much younger man who ended up being her 3rd husband. And so I didn't see mom for a good, I think it was a couple of years or something. And then my dad, the day before my brother's birthday, which was the day before my birthday, so he was born the day before my first birthday. So we were meant to have this birthday party. And my dad had been drinking And then when it was time to go home, my uncle, so his brother, wouldn't allow us to get in the car with him. Tried to stop him from driving, but couldn't. And so we followed him home and we watched him drive his car out in front of a semi-truck. He was in a coma for 13 days. And when he came out of the coma, my grandparents were told that he wouldn't be, in their words, much more than a vegetable. So they had their hands full with him. And at that point, my mom had been, we didn't know it, but had been in contact with my grandparents trying to get us back. And so they then shipped us off to live with mom again so that they could spend their time trying to help my dad rehabilitate, which he actually did quite well. I mean, he had a significant brain injury and was never quite the same. But he eventually, some years later, we were able to live as a family, my brother and I and my dad. He couldn't drive, so I had to do all the driving and, that kind of thing. So back to mum and this new husband. Initially it was okay, but before long, I mean, he was only, I think, 23 and she was 30. That became a very violent relationship as well. And it ended. And then my mum, who had been, doing pretty well, got back into heroin. And then we made another move. So for my freshman year of high school, so year 9, I don't even really know how I passed because I don't think I went more than a few weeks of the whole school year. At the end of that year, I made a decision to go live with my grandparents. I was, I think, 14 or 15 and decided that I didn't think that I would make it through high school if I stayed with my mom. And that was a really difficult decision because she was really not traveling well, but she wasn't looking after us either. So my brother had already been shipped off because she couldn't handle him. He'd been expelled already at that point, I think 3 times from schools. And so he was sent to live with my grandparents, and then I joined him. I suppose that's why I call Oregon home. When you ask where I'm from, I'll say Oregon. And that's because those were probably the most stable years of my life. So my year 10, 11, and 12, I still have a very best friend that lived across the street. And, we'd known each other since I was about 8 because she had lived there that whole time and I had been in and out. And so we were very close. She was a year ahead of me in school. Then from there, when Sarah was my best friend, still is my best childhood friend, when she left, she graduated and left our small town because it was a small rural town. We had a graduating class, I think, of around 60 students. And when she left, I got into a relationship with the person who would later become my husband. So my high school sweetheart. And when we graduated, he went into the military and we lived together for about a year and then broke up. And then I, proceeded to try to work out what I was going to do with my life. Had started, as I said, going to the junior college and then, I'd quit because it was too much so I had moved to the city to live with an aunt and uncle, and the city was just ridiculously overwhelming. It was just way too much for me. I felt completely alone and isolated. I didn't know anyone. I was actually living not far from my mom, so I saw her quite regularly. And then she died. And I kind of, I suppose, just panicked. And that's when I got back together with my high school sweetheart. And I just really craved stability. Out of respect for my children, I won't say much about that relationship, but I will say that the modeling for relationships weren't great for me. And so it's not a surprise, in relationship that I ended up in. There were a couple of things my mother did teach me just by watching her. And that was, one, no man is ever going to lay his hands on me. And so, I have been fortunate enough to avoid that kind of violence, which is good. And then the other one was that, she never really had anything. And she was always reliant on handouts. Literally, I remember as a child, her at the grocery store begging, asking for spare change, and she'd have my brother and I in tow. So she never had anything. She always relied on men. And so I knew that I would one day have a career of some sort. I would have something stable, because it was very, very important to me that I would always be able to look after my family, regardless if I had a partner or I didn't. I'd never, ever wanted to rely on anyone ever again. And so, yeah, I've managed to do that. I will just also add, I have a brother. I think I still have a brother. Unfortunately, he's had a pretty hard life, and I don't know how I managed to inherit the genes that I did, because I have never been in trouble with drugs or alcohol. I don't like the feeling of being out of control. And so, that's never been a problem for me. Unfortunately, he has spent his life in and out of jail and on and off the streets, and struggles with addiction. He pops in and out of my life, and I think he's got a dozen Facebook accounts, seems to open a new one each time he's kind of back on the scene. And I haven't heard from him for a while, so don't know. I also wanted to just clarify the things that I said about being an Aussie. I have nothing against America. In fact, when I came to Australia, I was incredibly patriotic. I think, like most Americans are, I never planned to stay here. But when I came here, it was like a brand new life. And I have built this life here, and I have a family that I've created, and then a family with my husband's family that have, welcomed me with open arms. So I've made a life here, and that's why I consider myself an Aussie. So I think that kind of maybe connects some of the dots. I know that the people who've been listening to my podcast probably were expecting maybe a little bit more explanation of the information that I have given on the podcast. And so, there it is.
What a lot to take in. We'll go back to the original interview now, and where we left off, Corina was reflecting on her move to Australia and how grateful she was that her children would have such a different upbringing to her own because of her opportunity to study medicine in Australia.
So first year, I was going to be 30 years old, right? And so it's time to have a family. Like, I always wanted a huge family. I wanted like 8 kids at one time. It's crazy to me now. But so we got here, thought, right, we're in the program. It's set. All I have to do is do the work. 4 years, I'll be a doctor. Like, I'm here. I'm where I want to be. I'll be able to provide for my family, So in first year, within a few months, we decided it's time to start a family. So I got pregnant and had the first child at the end of first year medicine. Flinders was just, they were awesome to me. They were so good to me. Second year, I just took her to school pretty much with me because it was, just breastfeed her, and we'd have a lecture. We had these problem-based learning tutorials. I'd just pop her on the floor with some toys, that kind of thing. It was awesome. And then third year was a clinical year. So then I had to start using some childcare. And then I got pregnant with my son early fourth year. My husband had, at the time, had a few issues getting through, and unfortunately didn't make it through the program. He failed third year, I think 3 times or something. And that first time, it was pretty stressful. And anyway, the marriage didn't make it. And so 14 weeks into that pregnancy, the marriage broke down. And then I became a single mom with a toddler, and then finished that fourth year. Fourth year was pretty cool because I had like little 6-week blocks. And so it's really interesting to me now because now I do obstetrics and I look after pregnant women and I look after women who really struggle getting pregnant or keeping a pregnancy. But for me, I thought, oh, this is pretty easy. Like I just planned to have a pregnancy and I had one. And so Lachlan, I planned I'll have a vacation time or like a holiday block when I have him. And so I just did that, and that's just what I did. And like Megan, I'll have her at the end of the year and I'll have some time off, and that's just how it was. And so the last term in fourth year was sleep medicine, which was so appropriate because Lachlan was like 6 weeks old. So I literally finished the term when I had him on Friday and had him on Monday. So I had a lot to learn about how that's pretty incredible.
How did you do it?
It's one of those things you just look back and you think, at the time you just do it, and then at the end, yeah. So yeah, being a single mom. So that was probably the most tricky when I graduated and then I had to get qualified. So it was never the plan to stay in Australia. I was always going back home. Home here now. And so it feels funny to say home. But yes, that was definitely home and I was never going to stay. So I had, Lachlan was like 4 months old. Megan was 3 years old when I graduated. I decided I would do my intern year and get registered here, and then I would go back to America. And so Flinders, again, just awesome, created the very first job sharing internship that they had ever done for myself and my best girlfriend who I met on the first day of medical school, who's from Canada. She was now pregnant with her first child. And so we shared a job, and it was hilarious because she's Canadian, American, have similar accent. And so when they approached the teams about us doing this, there was a lot of scratching of heads. One of the terms was in orthopedics. And so we kind of, in medicine, I think a lot of us joke about how it's a bit of a boys' club. It's a lot of males. And they just were not sure how this was going to work. And so we would do, like one of us would do Monday, Tuesday, half of Wednesday. At lunchtime, we'd hand over. The other one would finish Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and then we'd alternate weekends. And Suzanne, it was the girl that I did this with, probably a little bit more outspoken than I am. And so they just called us both Suzanne. I don't know if they ever knew that it was two different people. And we were just seamless because we were the kind of friends that could just finish each other's sentence. We'd show up and have the same shirt on that we had bought separately. Oh, you bought that one too. Right. So similar. So our conversations would be, very social. And then in the middle, oh, by the way, that echo, make sure that you follow that up for so-and-so, that kind of thing. And so at the end of that term, they actually at their meeting gave us like a standing ovation, and we're just so thrilled with how it worked. We made it look really easy, and it's still going today, that job sharing internship. So I did that over, I think it took me 18 months to get qualified. And during medical school, I had done all of my country terms. You have to do these rural terms, they start with 2 weeks. And then I did a 6-week block. That last 6-week block before I had Lachlan, in fact, was in Clare. And I fell in love with Clare. Clare Valley is just beautiful. Fell in love with Clare. And I was working with a solo GP who is just awesome. He's a prankster. He's just got so much personality and so much experience. And he had been a solo GP for many, many years. So, you have to be a certain kind of person to do solo rural GP kind of work. Really committed, amazing. He had said to me, I'll go back. I fell in love with Clare, and I thought if I did stay in Australia for whatever reason, that's where I'd want to end up. So talking with him, he encouraged me to go and get my obstetrics qualification because we really need obstetricians in the country. And you know what? I've been doing this now, I think, since 2007, so however many years that is, and we're still desperate for obstetricians in the country. So good on him. Here I am. And when I decided to stay, I did that term, and then I ended up in Clare, which was awesome.
How did you juggle all the placements and that with 2 young children? That must have been pretty tricky at times.
That's where the creativity comes in. So the ex-husband, there were lots of issues. He ended up going back to America. So I did the majority of that time by myself. So as an intern, fortunately, 19 hours was considered kind of full-time as that, half-time kind of work. And so I could do some overtime very easily and financially make a bit more. I suppose we weren't really talking about finances, but that was part of, what I had to problem solve and get creative about. I remember having yard sales to make petrol money, to put in my car, to drive across town, to do a locum job at the QEH so I could afford to feed my family and keep, rent and light and blah, blah, blah. When I did my obstetrics training, most of the other kind of 6-week block, or when you're an intern, it's a bit different. They're longer than that, were during the day. So I could use childcare. But then when I did my obstetrics training, I couldn't do that because there were lots of, time outside of regular working hours.
Babies don't work 9 to 5.
That's exactly right. So I've lost count now, but I think somewhere over 30 cousins in America. So my mum had 8 brothers and sisters.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And so, but funny enough, this cousin, the first one I brought to Australia, was from my dad's side. So she graduated from high school, and so she was cheap. So I just asked her, do you want to come to Australia and nanny for me while I finish off this, training? So she did, and she stayed with us for a year while I finished my training. And so she got, I paid her what I could, and she got this amazing experience in Australia. And then when I went to Clare and I did my GP training, I had another cousin from the other side of the family who was a substitute school teacher, still pretty young. She was about 26 at that time. I had to then do a fair bit of work before I could sit my exams. And so I invited her out, and I think she was here about a year as well, nannying for the kids.
What drives you? Like, what keeps you going? That would have been some fairly tough times.
Oh, so many times I would go, especially that whole, that childcare when you drop them off and they're crying and, and it just feels awful to leave them there. So many times I thought, that's it, I'm done. I can't do this anymore. But you know what? It's me. Like, I have to look after them. I'm their mother. I've got to provide for them. And I knew at the end of this road, no one was ever going to be able to take this qualification from me. I would always... I don't know why I'm so emotional today. I would always be able to provide for my family. And so that's what kept me going. I need to be able to get there. So you put your head down and get it done.
So life in Clare, you were there a little while?
4 years. And I did love it. It's a beautiful place and, a nice place to raise a family, not far from Adelaide. But then I met my husband, my now husband, from Renmark. And the river boys don't leave the river, I'm told. So here I am. But you know what? Great. Like this, it was one of the best moves I've made as well, because there were a lot more opportunities here for the kids as far as, there's basketball and baseball and I think there's 3 dance schools and there's a theater and plus, I just love it here.
How did you and Brett meet?
Oh, it's we were probably ahead of our time because we met online. Yeah, and we've been married now for what was that 2012? So 12 years. Yeah. So I think he's from here, so he would have pretty much. He was out of a relationship for a little while, and probably would have known everyone from here. He's pretty outgoing and seems to wave at everyone and talk to everyone, and. I was from Clare I was living in Clare, and that was a bit of a small area, and with, as a single mom, don't get out much. At that point, my ex-husband, this is kind of interesting, he had lost a job or something had happened in America, and I said, well, why don't you come back to Australia and nanny for me? So he came back, and he lived with us and kind of nannied for me. And then he met a woman from Clare and married her. I know, it's bizarre. And so then we kind of shared care. So then I had all this time on my hands. And so I started, looking into this internet stuff. And yeah, there we go. We met, and our first date was the longest first date that I think it probably made the Guinness World Records. We met because he was from here and I was from there. We decided to meet in the Barossa for lunch. We met in the Barossa. We had lunch. And that was a very long lunch. And then we kind of weren't done. And he said, do you want to go see a movie? So, okay. So we drove to Elizabeth and saw a first movie. Then we went and had a coffee or something. He's like, do you want to watch another movie? So we watched another movie, and then we had dinner, and then like it was well, maybe we had dinner between the movies, something like that. But we ended up watching 2 movies, had 2 meals, and then he drove me back to Barossa, and I said, are you going to kiss me? And that was it.
The rest is history.
Yeah, sometimes you just know.
Yeah, obviously you did with that. So it would have been a big change also too to pack up your life that you got really settled in Clare to then have to start again and move kids out of where they were probably happy as well.
Yeah. I actually, it wasn't a huge amount. I did have a little cottage there, which I loved. And I bought a place on the Riesling Trail not far off the Riesling Trail, was overlooking vineyards, because that's what I want. I really wanted to live overlooking vineyards. I just love them.
Is that the Californian born in you, perhaps?
No, it's probably some movie. That's I don't know. Really idealistic. I just love the way grapevines look. You know what? Actually, it's probably Claire. It's probably Claire that did it. I want to live and look over the grapevines. So luckily, I married a viticulturalist, and now we live next to the grapevines. So,
and then moving into, I think around that time that you moved to the Riverland, there was a real doctor shortage in Renmark at that time. There were some older doctors retiring. I think obstetrics were just being transferred from Renmark all to Berry. You would have been welcomed with open arms, I would imagine.
Yeah, so when Brett and I started talking about me moving, I said, well, how about you have a chat, because one of the partners of the practice then was, and I think he still is very involved in the footy club. Brett would see him quite often at the footy club. And I said, well, why don't you just kind of float it past him? Do they need anyone down there? And he apparently, was pretty much was like, wow, really? Yeah, bring her on down. And so very early on, I'd had a visit, and this particular doctor took me for a drive, to show me the place and just have a chat, and probably feeling me out, making sure I wasn't a weirdo or something. Yeah, they were pretty happy. And I have been here like that 12, 13 years this year, and I'm still I think when I got here, there was an overseas trained female. There was, who was here for a little while, but for the majority of that time, I have been the only stable female at the practice. Yeah, which is, we need more girls.
Oh, absolutely. Is that strange, living in a small community? You have, I would say, predominantly female, clients, patients. Clients.
Some people call them clients. I think that's the politically correct way of saying it. I still call them patients. I guess I'm old-fashioned.
It must be strange going down the street going, oh, yes, I've, put a Marina in you, or I've delivered your baby, or I've given you a pap smear.
This is the funny thing. So when I was in my previous marriage, and so I would go and have a pap smear at the clinic on the base. We lived on base a couple of times. And I remember once seeing that she was a nurse practitioner, I think, did my pap smear. I saw her in the commissary at the grocery store, and I was mortified. I didn't want to make eye contact. Oh my gosh, right? I honestly do not remember at all. Because I do and see so much. And I have gotten so much better at not taking things home with me. So, I do that consult. That's put away. I move on to the next one. And I honestly do not, unless you've got, some nice big piercing or, something like that that's really memorable, I honestly can't even remember. I'll ask, so did I do your Marina? Or, yeah. So please, girls, don't be worried. I know how that feels, but you don't need to be worried.
You went on to do obstetrics at the Berry Regional Hospital as well. Are you still doing that?
Yeah. Yep. I probably will be winding that back soon. I've let the hospital know that, this is what I'm thinking. I don't know what that looks like yet, but I'm getting tired. A couple of weeks ago, I ended up doing 2 sections, one at midnight, one at 7 in the morning. I had 15 minutes of sleep, and there's just no one else to call. It's just, that's how it is. And unfortunately, there'll be one less when I go, but I just can't keep up the space anymore. That killed me for days.
I was going to say, regional GPs and obstetricians, gynecologists are notoriously known to be overworked, have so much on their plate. How do you balance that with your life? You said you were able to sort of switch off now, but has that always been the case?
No. I remember very clearly, especially in those first few years in general practice, going home and feeling like I wasn't a good mother and I wasn't a good doctor because I couldn't give either one as much as I felt I needed to give. And I would often just give everything I had while I was at work that day. I didn't know how to compartmentalize it, so that was a learned skill. And I think I've always been very good at stepping back, taking inventory. What do I need to do to balance my life better? How can I do this better? I think I've always been naturally good at being able to do that. And so early on, I asked for a day off a week at general practice where I was in Clare. So that helped balance that out. When I got here, so I'll go back a step again. When I was in Clare, they practiced pseudo private obstetrics, which meant that you're on call 24/7, which is, what the obstetricians in the city do. That's not what I wanted to do. I couldn't manage that. So when I got here, they were on a roster. So that was very welcome. It was, you knew what days you were on. You knew 3 months in advance what days you were on, so you could really plan. And then as time went, I decided what would be best for me is if I had a set day. And so for years now, I've done Tuesdays. So from 8 a.m. Tuesday to 8 a.m. Wednesday, that's my day. I know I'm doing it. It's in writing. I can plan around it. And in the last few years, that team has really changed. So, the guys that were working when I got here have retired. And so it's they're all probably 10 plus years younger than I am. They've decided, and they've got young families and they're trying to balance it all as well. So they've decided this is a great idea. And so we all kind of have some days that are pretty set. And I think that works, that helps.
Keeps that consistency and allows you to plan for things outside of work as well. You're definitely a woman of many talents. We've talked about your artwork, but you do really have that creative streak as well. We might get onto that in a minute, but fitness is also something that and being active is something that seems really important to you. Just how important is that?
I've exercised all my life, and I think early on it was, probably so I could fit into my clothes and feel better about my body, as we do when we're young. And that has really changed in the last couple of years. So going through this midlife transition period, which has really taken me by surprise and devastated me, I have had to take a step back again and take some inventory and work out what I needed to do here. So we lose our muscle mass very naturally in our 30s. That starts. And around the menopause time, it really picks up the pace, and then it continues on. And again, it picks up the pace, I think, in your mid-60s. And our muscle mass is so important for so many functions of our body. And after menopause, we become so much more at risk of so many chronic diseases that our muscle mass is really pivotal in helping us prevent. So about a year ago, my cardio was always kind of, took the priority. You wanted to lose a few kilos, you just up your cardio and,
You've done things like marathons and that sort of thing as well, haven't you?
Yeah. And that's probably just for a bit of a challenge. I've done some triathlons, etc. That was just for fun. One time, I think many years ago, I thought, I want to do that. And so I think I was around 40 when I did my first triathlon, and it was just for fun. I was never, overly competitive, but just for fun. And I've always loved weightlifting, but the cardio work always took precedent. Part of that is also managing stress and anxiety. And so I've done that for many years for those reasons. So that's been a real motivator to continue to do it. But this kind of change in my life around this age, about a year ago, I started to focus more on just making sure that I build my muscle mass and I maintain my muscle mass. And so the weight lifting, the resistance trainings take priority.
You do love a challenge. I can see that for sure. You've also just not long returned from a big hike on the Camino Trail. How did that all come about?
A few years ago when I was at some event for my son and met some mums that I hadn't met before. And they were just talking about this thing called the Camino Trail. And I thought, oh, what's that? So I learned more about it and I thought, I'm doing that. That sounds amazing. It's a pilgrimage and there's lots of different trails that end in Santiago in Spain. And so I decided I'm going to learn the language and then at some point I'm going to go over there and do it. And so, yeah, that's what I did.
So you're not just going on this hike. You have to do the whole, you have to learn the language. Like you don't do things by halves, do you?
No.
How was that?
Oh, it was amazing. Yeah. So I only did a little portion of it. So the whole thing in this particular trial is about, I think, 800 Ks or something. And usually people take about a month. But I did, I think it took 10 days. And I just did the last 120 or so Ks. Yeah, I did that. Yeah, by myself, and it was interesting and fun, and yeah. And on that one, that's where I was listening to your podcast and thought, I'm an empty nester now. I've got a bit of extra time. This whole midlife thing has really rocked my world. I didn't feel that I had gotten enough education, and then when I reflected, I thought, you know what? Actually, we don't get a lot of education.
I was going to say, as a GP, it still hit you hard.
Oh yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Because there's a lot of reasons for it, but we need better education. So at the moment, there's an inquiry in Australia in the Senate to do this better, this perimenopause, menopausal time period better. The idea is to try to educate not only our practitioners, but women and all those people who are in a position to support her. So, maybe half of us somewhere around that might have mild to no symptoms, and they don't know what the other half's talking about. And that other half, they don't really talk about it very much. So when I started asking the questions, wow, they've either been shot down before or, their friends aren't having a problem. So they think maybe something's wrong with me. So during that walk, I decided I want to do more in this area. So I started this podcast to get information out to people. And since then, I have had so many older women who are listening to it come to me and say, thank you. Like it wasn't all in my head. It wasn't just me. And you know what? They've also reassured me that this does pass. It could take 10 years, but it will pass.
Let's talk a bit more about your podcast now then. And so you're walking along, trudging along in Spain, you go, listening to Riverland women going, I could do that and do it about perimenopause.
Yeah.
What were the next steps, and I guess how did you go about planning and choosing what issues to focus on, and where do you see the future of your podcast? Lots of questions in that one, sorry.
Yeah. So there's been this taboo on menopause hormone treatment. That's the new way of saying hormone replacement
because
therapy.
It causes cancer, right?
Well,
that's what we've been
told. So when I was in medical school, there was a study that came out. So this is over 20 years ago that... it was a bit of a scandal, really. Essentially, the study, the way that it worded the results, it overemphasized this risk of cancer. And it's interesting because so all of us were, terrified of prescribing it. Patients were terrified to take it. And so we've had this 20 years of women not being treated how they should have been, right? When I've gone back and I've looked at what was being published around that time. So the college that I am fellowed in, the RACGP, they did a paper about a month after this study was published. And the paper said, pretty much clear people, our background risk of getting breast cancer is about 7%. And with this particular type of HRT, which we don't use as much anymore, there's other, what I think are better options. But with those, your risk of breast cancer increases to about 8.5%. But the way that this study was worded, the results of the study, it made you think, wow, if I take this, I'm going to get breast cancer. But at 1.5%, the absolute risk is actually less. It's 0.8%. That's the risk that you're going to get breast cancer on hormone replacement. And there's so many benefits to it. So it took me a long time because that was so ingrained in my head. I thought, well, why aren't we all on this if that's the case? I don't understand. And there's lots of reasons, and that's a whole talk in itself. But I wanted to just educate people, if you're really suffering, then there's definitely treatment. And anyway, you can be treated if you're only mildly suffering. And it can be very protective for lots of chronic diseases as well. But not only that, also the non-medical things that you should be doing, like all those chronic diseases that you're now at risk of, that I don't think many women know about. And I can only see like 25 people in a day. But if I'm here on, spreading the message around, I've looked today, I have 100 people in 150 cities listening. So all the countries are the same. Well, UK, America, Canada, Australia, all the same. We've all been terrified and none of us have been talking about it. And this is now a conversation around the world. Women want this information. They want to do better. They want to feel better. We live longer than the boys, as a general rule, but our quality of life in those last few years can often be pretty crap. And so I want the message out. If we can do something now about that. It doesn't, if you don't want to take menopause hormone treatment, you don't have to. There are other things that you could be doing. And those are the messages I wanted to get out.
Yeah. So what are some of the topics you've covered so far?
I started with the hormone treatment because I think that that's probably the biggest stumbling block for people. I've talked half of this also because of where I've come from. And, I've had to really be creative and I suppose work hard and find ways of getting where I am. And I haven't had, anyone take me by the hand like I do with my kids, and teach them. I've had to look for models. I've learned a lot. And part of that, the whole mental health side of that, I really wanted to focus on that as well. And just simple kind of life coaching tools and things like that for people to feel better and to live better lives. So the podcast is kind of split between those two types of things. So I've done some things on, how our thoughts affect us and stress and the things that happen through this midlife transition, as well as other states of your life, like with sleep disturbance. I've talked about sleep. And the very last one I did was on contraception because there's, some people think, well, maybe I don't need to take any contraception because I don't think I'm going to get pregnant. It can happen. So talk about what your options are and why.
And what's ahead for the Opt to Thrive podcast?
I don't know. I just taken it kind of, I do it every 2 weeks. I do an episode. And at the moment, it's probably, initially I thought I'll have a few things already recorded and ready to go. But I'm really a fly by my seat of my pants kind of girl. And so I kind of just go with, what am I feeling? What are people asking me? What am I seeing more at work? Where are people confused? What do they need? I really want to give people what they need. And so it's kind of just happening organically, whatever the next topic is. And I don't know, I can see myself doing this for a long time. I'm managing that 2 weekly schedule really quite well and I'm loving it. And I'm loving the marketing side of it, which was a big surprise for me. I'm just loving the creative side and seeing what people respond to, what makes them click onto things and what makes them pay attention. And
so you on TikTok and all of
yes.
that? Yes.
I'm like one of the 11% of people my age on TikTok. Like some of the young people are like, what? Yeah, that's me.
I have a few quick questions to wrap up.
Okay.
So favourite place in the Riverland and why?
It's probably a bit boring. I'm a homebody. So my sun porch is probably my favorite place in the Riverland. If I had to pick some place outside of my home, because I just love this old farmhouse. I'm in love with it. If I leave here, it's going to be the river or a Rosto is pretty good too. That's a little plug for a Rosto.
Best advice anyone has given you?
The first thing that comes to mind, it's not really, I guess, advice. I've talked about this before, I think on my very first podcast, but when I went to work for the Red Cross, it was such a pivotal time for me. The chapter manager was a woman. It was all women. And I had never been around so many like strong, independent, ambitious, amazing women. And I modeled, like she was such a good model for me. And she had this plaque on her wall that said commitment, accountability, responsibility, integrity, and self-respect. And I took that and I have tried to live by those principles from that point.
Well, Corina, thank you very much for having a chat to me on the Riverland Women podcast.
You're welcome. It's been really good. Thank you for having me.
That was Dr. Corina Sims from Renmark. You can find her podcast, Opt to Thrive, on all the usual platforms, and you can also follow on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd love it if you could share on your own socials, maybe leave a review where you're listening to it, or leave some comments on the Riverland Women pages on Facebook and Instagram. Thank you for listening to Riverland Women.